I can't tell you how excited I am to be here this morning. As I was getting ready for this service in the last week or so, I realized it's been close to 2 years since I have led a service from a pulpit. So I'm really glad, while we find out if I remember how you do that I'm among friends. I'd like to invite you to be in a spirit of meditation for just a few moments. We breathe the common wind of the earth, no matter where we live, who we love, what language we speak. We drink the common water of the earth, no matter the color of our skin, how long we live, the coverings we drape on our forms. We follow the common paths of the earth, no matter our beliefs, how far we move from home, the gold that we carry, or its lack. May we live from these truths, our hearts open to the holiness all around us, our hands turned always toward the common good. What seems to me now like 100 years ago, I was a quite unhappy stay-at-home mom with 2 very small children. I spent lots of time madly searching for ways to fill my days and feel useful to the world. We didn't have a lot of money, and I really couldn't afford babysitters very often, so the opportunities had to be very compelling. I heard about a 3-day seminar on something called nonviolent communication and decided it might be worth the effort, which primarily involved talking my mother into babysitting my 2 toddlers for the time I was in the seminar. You need to understand that my mother was something of a social butterfly and really didn't want to be tied down with my kids. So I knew she would exact a heavy price for this. However, she agreed to do it. And the seminar was everything I could hope for. It was peopled with lots of folks I wanted to get to know, and it was interesting to boot. The first day, the seminar leader gave us a lecture about what nonviolent communication involved and then broke us up into groups of 7. I was pleased that he was basically talking about Carl Rogers' communication model, where one listened to the speaker, paraphrased what they said to you, and then if they agreed that you had understood it correctly, you got to respond with your own reaction. I knew about that since I'd studied it in college. For the rest of the first day, we practiced the method with the instruction that we were each to pick someone else in our small group and tell them something nice that we had noticed about them. It was a piece of cake, and we all got to feel good in the process. Not so on the second day, when we were to practice the communication method some more, but this time with the prompt that we were to pick someone in the group and tell them why we didn't like them, why they just turned us off big time. Looking around my small group, I could see that I wasn't the only one who felt terribly insecure about this, but that was very little consolation because, of course, there was one guy who had no hesitation about going first. And guess what? He picked me. He proceeded to tell me that he didn't like me, didn't like the way I looked, didn't like any of the things I'd said the day before, and basically just thought I was worthless. It was like my worst nightmare come to life. And of course, it didn't end there, because after he had totally humiliated me publicly, my task was to tell him what he'd just said, but I couldn't use his words. I had to paraphrase, which meant I got to now humiliate myself by finding a way to describe me that was equally negative in my own words. I thought for only a moment about just leaving, but I'd used up all my mother's goodwill for this, and I didn't want to waste it. So I somehow managed to paraphrase his words in a manner he would accept, which meant that now it was my turn. What I wanted to do was look at him and say, why would you even imagine I give a damn what you think? Who do you think you are? And you can substitute a stronger swear word in there, and it will probably be pretty accurate for how I was feeling. But again, I was at the seminar to learn, and we were supposed to respond with our feelings. So I pulled it together, looked him in the eye, and said, I really feel awful about that, because I want people to like me and think well of me. It hurts to hear that you feel so negatively about me, and I wish I could do something to change that. Now, what absolutely blew me away at the moment I finished my response was realizing that there were 5 people in the room who were not only very positively impressed with me, but also were definitely on my side. Surprisingly, the power in the room at that moment was all mine. I won. Now, I didn't realize yet that nonviolent communication isn't about winning and losing. It's not a zero-sum game where if I win, that means you lose. That was pretty much the world I'd been raised in, and it wasn't for at least another few months until I realized this nonviolent communication is a win-win situation. I won because I told him honestly how I felt, and he won because he got to point out something that was true for him. The first question you should be asking me is, wasn't what he said violent communication? It was nasty and mean, wasn't it? The answer to the first question is no. While it certainly seemed that what he said was mean, it wasn't violent. You probably didn't wonder when I told you what we were supposed to do on the first day, the nice comments, things we liked about the other person. It was just sharing an honest observation. And the same was true on the second day. We are always able to offer honest observation, either positive or negative. The difference lies in how we word it. Calling names or demeaning someone would be violent, but simply disagreeing with or criticizing someone isn't violent. The trick is honesty. You only say things that are honest as you understand them. It goes beyond just telling the truth because it reveals what is true about you, the speaker. You respond with your honest emotions. And that's sometimes hard to do because it involves sharing things that maybe aren't the most positive things about yourself, sharing your weaknesses or even failures. And the whole process invites you to share things about someone else they may not consider polite. How often do we tell someone we don't like something about them except if we're angry with them and with the intention of putting them down? In other words, win-lose. That's what people tend to expect when they're criticized, and nobody likes that. But working through something with another person honestly is what nonviolent communication demands. And I learned that that can only lead to personal growth. In order to do all that, you have to trust your listeners, another characteristic of nonviolent communication. The corollary for me is that if you want people to trust you and therefore to share the truth as they know it, you have to be trustworthy. Nonviolent communication goes both ways. And let's face it, It isn't always easy to trust those who might be listening to you, especially if you don't know them very well. So you might be asking yourself, why would I share this very personal story about me with you this morning? The only answer that I can give you is that I trust myself, which is an important thing if I'm going to promote the use of nonviolent communication. I trust myself, even if you think my story shows that I'm weak, immature, or worse yet, incompetent. I can still love myself. So taking the risk that my story, far from encouraging the use of nonviolent communication, might be a real turnoff for you, is worth it to me. Because you see, what I really hope is that you will instead think, well, if she can do that in front of all of us, I could probably do it too. The real question I hope you are asking is, what's in it for me to learn to do nonviolent communication and then find the courage to practice it? And that requires being willing to look at oneself with a critical eye. And to begin to answer that question, I have to go back to that seminar experience. When I got home that evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom and I asked myself, why did he choose me? What I saw made it clear pretty quickly. There's a big piece of information I haven't shared with you yet, and that is that I was newly pregnant. I didn't show yet, but my waistline was already growing. My hair was limp and lifeless, and I hadn't bothered with any makeup on skin that was not particularly healthy looking. That's what pregnancy always did to me in the beginning. I didn't like my looks at that point all 3 times, and I certainly hadn't tried to look my best that day. So it was immediately obvious that I was almost asking for it. I was telegraphing subtly that I didn't think well of myself right then. And while it's certainly okay, even good, to be willing to be vulnerable, that requires that you actually know you are a valuable person. So I decided to take ownership for what I could do for day 3. And instead of just blaming him for being mean, I washed my hair, picked out the least obvious outfit that didn't make me look quite so fat, and put on makeup the next morning. When I arrived at the seminar, I was feeling much better about myself, and that, I know, affected the way I carried myself, my facial expressions, and other nonverbals. Day 3 went much more smoothly, and I realized that not only had I gotten to know some of these people that I wanted to, but they did view me in a positive light. One of the ways that nonviolent communication benefits us is that because we are required to openly listen to and then honestly consider what others tell us, it often shines a light into who we are. It certainly allows us to understand ourselves better, and it can lead to personal growth. If we truly listen and consider what others say to us, then we can ask ourselves, what part of this dilemma do I own? A question that I've learned to ask myself about any problem I encounter. I hope I don't need to tell you that none of us are perfect, even though we sometimes like to fool ourselves into believing that that is the picture we present to the world. Once we give up on perfection, we can allow ourselves to listen to the counsel of others, forgive ourselves when we mess up, and sometimes recognize truths we didn't see before. There are actually several other benefits for each of us in practicing nonviolent communication, too many to cover in one sermon. So my intention today is only to whet your appetite so you will want to look into other benefits. There's one very important one, though, that I must share with you today, and that is the requirement to be non-judgmental. Being judgmental blocks our ability to listen openly and to respond effectively. In fact, Violence often comes from blaming others for our pain, disappointment, or feelings of failure. Blaming them for their failings, think about the reading we just heard from Meg Barnhouse, instead of generously understanding they're probably doing the best they can. In other words, approaching others with love instead of critique. And out of love can come empathy, which leads to nonviolent communication. When we have empathy for another person, we listen to both the truth of what they are saying and what it is telling us about them so that we can better understand what is going on. And we can respond with generosity of spirit, knowing that the world will be a more peaceful place if we cut each other some slack. Empathy requires us to listen without making judgments about the worth of the other person. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we can't be angry, nor would it be true we can't think someone is wrong. But responding with real words that attack or demean the first speaker doesn't resolve anything. When we can say honestly how we are feeling, even if it is anger, we can move forward. But oh boy, is that hard to do. On my good days, I can do it, but no one always does it right. So again, don't think you need to be perfect or that you will be. I learned about that all those years ago, too. By the end of the third day, I was able to see the man who insulted me as a human who had problems in his life, too. In fact, over the next few years, we were frequently in the same groups, and I actually got to like him. That's what I mean by generosity of spirit. I'm guessing you know that I didn't much like him on day 2 of that seminar. Later, when he got fired from his job unfairly, I was one of the people who consoled him, and I honestly felt bad for him. Remember, true nonviolent communication comes out of love, and love requires empathy. Also, one of the main goals of nonviolent communication is getting along with others. The more we can do that, the more impact we can have on those with whom we interact. That alone would make it the best form of communication in my mind. The leader of that seminar was a handsome young man from St. Louis who was a PhD professor, although no one had heard of him at that point. His name was Marshall Rosenberg, and it turns out he was just beginning to work on his communication theory, which he called nonviolent communication. I still think it's amazing that I got to know him at the very beginning of his world-changing work. What a gift that was. He's frequently quoted for his wisdom. A couple of his sayings that I'm particularly fond of are, "We use nonviolent communication to evaluate ourselves in ways that engender growth rather than self-hatred." That's not fun, but I have found when I find the courage to look at my part in any problem honestly, instead of blaming someone else, it always works to my benefit. The second Marshall Rosenberg quote that I particularly like is, "Empathy allows us to perceive our world in a new way and move forward." It's always been true that when I can focus on what the other person is telling me, either that they need or want, instead of what they are doing wrong, I can find ways to move forward that promote good relationships. And that's not always easy. Often I think it would be better to just be bitchy and judge the other person for getting in my way. But the truth is that time and again, with a little thought, I can forgive what's getting in my way and offer a non-judgmental alternative that the other person can accept. And when I'm upset, Marshall Rosenberg invites me to ask myself what it is that the other person is doing that is a trigger for my being judgmental about them. In other words, go back to what is it that triggers me to want to lash out. And that's looking at me, not at them. And then I need to make space for myself to be less than perfect, because I certainly want to acknowledge that. And of course, I need to be willing to allow them to be imperfect. I've already said that's only true on those rare times when I am being perfect. Marshall Rosenberg considers NVC, as he calls it, a spiritual practice, and I can easily see that it fits with our UU principles, certainly with our first principle, which requires us to offer respect for the worth and dignity of every person, every person. I struggle with this one more than any of the other 6, since I think it's only human nature that we are occasionally irritable enough that we violate that every person part of it. Nonviolent communication is one of the ways we can live out the first principle. When I remember to practice it, I can much more easily recognize the worth of everyone. Likewise, principles 2 and 3 fit in. Certainly, justice, equity, compassion, and acceptance are all words that resonate with non-judgmental communication. Maybe the very best principle is number 7, that admonishes us to recognize the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, which I believe requires us to remember we're all in this together and to look for solutions rather than judgment or retribution. None of that is easy. But then, haven't we all been about this all long enough to know that the really important stuff is never easy? So I want to highly recommend nonviolent communication as one more difficult thing you can add to your list.